So I thought I'd try a video where I'm speaking into the microphone. This enduring problem, I don't know, about low volume. I will probably get a phone or something that might be better. This phone has been very good. It's a Chinese one, and I intend to get another Chinese one. So maybe I'll just go from the frying pan into the fire, which is a common route that we do take. I've made my breakfast. It's ready there, and it's just in the warming area of the barbecue. That's a great barbecue, I must say. Anybody who's thinking of doing something like this, I can totally recommend it. My one is called a char broil. I spent a little bit more to get something that would be weather resistant. So this morning is one of those mornings, and I started smoking a pipe when I was in Norwich. Now, Norwich is somewhere, if anybody's listening from different parts of the world or the country who haven't seen Norwich, I would recommend a visit to Norwich. It's a beautiful little town and a historic town. And it has many churches with flint exteriors and very quaint and beautiful. And I had an experience with Norwich that is curious looking back on it, because my second, I suppose, girlfriend, the one that I really liked, my third girlfriend rather, the more serious one, where we made love together for the first time in my life. She was a lovely young lady, and she attended the University of East Anglia, which is in Norwich, and studied art history there. So I went to see her one day, back in the olden days when there was communication was limited, and I'm not a very communicative person mainly. And I turned up and she wasn't there. I couldn't get hold of her. And I'd kind of relied on her for my accommodation that night, because she was in the halls of residence, which had only just been built, and which I admired the other day when I was there to visit my daughter, who has also connected with the University of East Anglia. And I remarked to her that, I'd seen these buildings many, many years ago when the university was new. And so there I was in Norwich at the age of probably 17 or 18. And I remember it was a very rainy night, and I had no wits about me or money, probably mainly. In those days we used to travel with £10, not really enough to get you a room in a hotel at the time. There were no cheap hotels, there were just main hotels. And I walked around the streets of Norwich for a while in the evening, as it was dark and wet. And I saw a church which had a large sheet of plywood. I think it might have been a sign or something, and it was leaning against the wall. And so I snuck in there and I leaned the sheet of plywood against the wall in a manner that would create a sort of tent underneath. And I crept in and I slept there that night. It's the first time I've ever done something like that. I'd ever done something like that. And so I slept a night in Norwich. Now hear me. When I returned to Norwich for the first time after that, so probably nearly 50 years later, or more than 50 years, I'm not quite sure, I went back to Norwich to visit my daughter. My daughter has had a connection with Norwich. Her university, she worked with the University of East Anglia for a year and enjoyed it immensely and loved the town. And her interaction with the language department of Norwich continues, an interaction of which I am critical, but for reasons that are really not relevant to the story. And I'm not critical of my daughter, of course. Every man and every woman is entitled to proceed as they see fit. Let's be clear about this. So when I went to visit my daughter in Norwich a couple of years ago, I chose an Airbnb place, which was actually really nice. It was a basement, expensive, but just comfortable. And the it was the window in the living room. It was a basement, but it was what they would call in Italian seminterrato. So it had some um, windows that would still admit light at the top of the walls. And there was such a window in the living room, and I looked out of it, and there was a churchyard. And I became curious, I suppose, and I went around during the stay and I visited the church. And lo and behold, it was the very same church in where I had slept so many years, 50 years beforehand. And there it was in front of my window. It's odd how things go, isn't it? And I went into the church actually, perhaps on the next visit, and I spoke to the custodians who were organizing meaningless art exhibitions inside the church, which has probably been, is it called deconsecrated or something? And I confessed my sleepover so many years ago, and they were quite. The lady who was taking the money was interested. I suppose it was a curious story, and she invited me to write it down in the visitors' book, which I did. And I also paid £10 for my stay at the time. Just joking, I suppose, really. The stay was hardly worth £10 all those years ago. It was a fairly uncomfortable night. But there it is, you know. How can we explain this? Would you call it synchronicity, perhaps? Norwich just appears and in my life. And you know, it's become a university town now, but I think searching through the history of Norwich, it was an important port, I think. And in the olden days, boats could sail down to Norwich. Although it's inland, there's an extensive system of waterways and natural rivers and lakes. It's a really beautiful area. And the very King of England has an estate at Sandringham, quite nearby. It's a bit posh, you know, too posh for people like me, probably, because I wouldn't have the coin to go and live in Norwich. And you know, because it's become posh and trendy, it's attracted all the things that, you know, I don't really like. I prefer just standard stuff. God bless this morning.